Mr. Washington, it's a real pleasure to be able to come in your home and to interview you, so thank you so much for that. I want to start off by asking you, how did you become our first president? I mean, what was that like? Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for taking the time to come. I love talking about my history and the history of this country I love. So I was actually unanimously elected. That means every single person voted for me. And back then they each had 2 votes. So one was used for me by everybody, because it was me. And then the other one they got to use for anyone else. But obviously they all voted for me. I led the Continental Army, I led the Constitutional Convention. I was just, it was me, so everybody picked me. Yeah, me. Now, can you explain what a precedent is? Yeah, I set a few precedents back in my day, I guess you could say. I was pretty big at hosting parties. I had some pretty great ones. Always had lots of dancing, food, and just everybody had a good time. So I just kind of set the stage for that. And when foreign dignitaries came to visit, I entertained them. So I think everybody pretty much followed that from me, as a precedent, I said. I also split up the executive branch into 4 parts. I made the leaders of each section, I call them secretaries, they're part of my cabinet, and they kind of ran the show in each one, but at the end of the day, they had to listen to me because I was the boss. And let's see, I only served 2 terms as president. When I was done with my second, I decided I'm going to retire. They definitely would have had me come back if I wanted to, but I chose not to. And I just decided to let someone else come in and run the show, and John Adams ended up doing that, following after me. And I also used the federal government to show power. I thought that was pretty important to do. Now, can you give us an example of that? Well, I showed our power with the federal government when I actually led an army in and kind of scared some people in Pennsylvania. We passed a whiskey excise tax. And I'm sure you know what an excise tax is, right? It's a tax on a specific good, and ours was on whiskey, which actually I was the biggest distiller in the United States at the time, so, I was actually taxing myself too. But these farmers in Pennsylvania got a little upset about it, and they got mad, and they decided to protest, and they're boycotting, and all that stuff, saying, "Oh, you're just as bad as the king," but I'm not, because I'm great. And so I went in with the army and I stopped it, and I showed that the government will use force if we have to keep the laws in place. So now that is truly amazing. Let's switch over to foreign affairs, though. You took a unique position when it came to dealing with other countries. Can you explain what you did and the reasoning behind that? Yeah, while I was president, we had some issues with some other countries. Britain was still kind of upset, because I beat them in war, and so they, at the end, when they promised to leave our forts in the West, they actually didn't. And so we thought a couple years later we might have to go to war with them again to try to make them stop. And they were also impressing. They would take our sailors on the sea and put them on their ships and tell them, "Hey, you have to work for us now." And we're like, "That's not cool." So, we thought we'd have to go to war for those. But luckily I had my friend John Jay. He was our Chief Justice at the time. He went over and made a treaty, and of course we named it after him, just to say thanks, so we called it Jay's Treaty. And we actually didn't even bring up impressment, so we kind of messed up there. But the British did promise to leave our forts, which was good, so we prevented a war. The problem, they actually didn't leave either, so it didn't really do anything. But we did prevent a war, so that was good. We actually had problems too with the Spanish. When we made the Articles of Confederation, we had some issues, and they wouldn't let us use the Mississippi River, which was not good for our backcountry farmers. They couldn't get their goods to market anymore. And they wouldn't even let us use New Orleans, so even if we could have gone down the river, we'd been stuck there. So to try to solve this, we sent one of my friends, Pinckney, and he went over and made a deal with them and said, "Hey, why don't you let us use this? That'd be great." And so they let us, and that was good for the economy. We just named it after him too. We called it Pinckney's Treaty. That sounds like that would be a really tough thing to deal with. Were there other parts of your presidency that were especially difficult? Yeah, we had a few other issues with the presidency. One thing was we were trying to figure out where to put the capital. It was in New York. We moved it to Philadelphia for a bit, and people in the north said, well, it should stay in the north. We've got a bigger population, we've got the big cities, it kind of makes sense to have the capital there. We want people to be impressed when they come over. And people in the south said, no, 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 it should be in the south. This is kind of where the heart of the country started. Virginia, my home state, we thought that would be pretty good. So we had some arguments there. At the same time, we're trying to figure out how to pay all of our debts off. The South had pretty much paid its debts. It was really the North trying to figure it out. And that was just pretty tough to work through. And at that time, Alexander Hamilton had a good idea. He said, maybe the federal government should take everybody's debts. We call that assumption, where they just assume everyone's debts. And he thought if we did that, then we could start establishing good credit with other countries. And they'd be more likely to invest in us, and it would be helpful in getting our economy going. The South was not a fan of that since they didn't have any debt. They didn't really want to take everyone else's debt too. They thought, they just need to kind of work harder up there, and the farmers in the South shouldn't have to pay for the businessmen in the North to get their debts taken care of. And so we had an issue there, and what they decided to do was, well, I had the idea, I guess, that they should have a compromise. And so we had a little dinner party over at TJ's place, and they got together. TJ, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison went too. And they decided to make a deal. And the deal was the South would get the capital. So we put it just outside of Virginia, kind of between it and Maryland. Later on they'll name it after me though, And of course. So the South got that, and then the South got its goal, and the national government would assume the debts of all the states. And so it was a good compromise. And since it was at a dinner party, we call it the dinner party compromise. Later on, we'd have a problem though, because Alexander Hamilton, he always wants to go a little further and a little further. And he wanted to make a national bank that would take care of all the money problems and just help to make other countries want to invest us even more, just to show that we're a more secure economy. And I like the idea, but Thomas Jefferson hated it. He was all about, oh, your national government's going to be too big, things like that. So, but since I was president, I said, Alexander, I like your thinking, and so we did it. So that's why we made the national bank. Now, Mr. Washington, you finished your second term in office. You're ready to retire and go back home to Mount Vernon. What was the final couple pieces of advice you gave people as they came? I know you had a speech called, that we call today, Washington's Farewell Address. What was your advice for people coming to lead this country? Yeah, when I left office, I left a couple pieces of advice. And I said to stay out of foreign affairs. That was a big one. That's why I made that proclamation of neutrality, was just showing we need to focus on us and not worry about what everybody else is doing. So stay out of foreign affairs. And I also said don't make political parties. I knew it'd be disastrous. We wouldn't get anything done because everybody would be disagreeing. You'd have all these people on this side and these people on this side. So I said no political parties. But right after they left, well, they completely ignored me and made political parties. So what can you do though? Mr. Washington, I really want to thank you for your time today. It just was such an honor, and I feel like we just learned so much about your life. So thank you for all you've done for our country, and hopefully we can carry on the legacy left behind us. Thank you. Oh, it was my pleasure, of course.